So I brought my texture in on my main object, right? If I just show you. Oops, I had a few materials. So to go to the material editor, I can create a new blend texture. That will give me a box like this. I can focus to that box, right, with F. Then in my Unity project where I'd already copied the substance textures, right, I clicked on the object that was textured, the one that I did in class. I expanded the material here in the components, and then clicked on the albedo map, which is the color, and that shows it which folder it was in. And then, like we confirmed the other day, you should be able to drag things into Maya, but maybe we have to be a little sneaky about that with our window size. Right, so you can drag textures directly into Maya, or into the Hypershade, rather. And then the last step is just to hook up the output color to the input color of the blend, and assign that texture, in my case blend 4, to the object. Right, so again, you don't want to work too much in a vacuum in Maya, right? I could be here just modeling in gray. You also have to hit 6 on the keyboard, right, to enable shaders for wireframe, 5 for gray boxes, and 6 for textured mode. But really the point is just to remember why you're here and why you're modeling out something, right? So some things will occur to you seeing them all together in Maya, since our scale is matched, that you might not think of, right? Like you might just be like, oh, well, if I have this room as an exit room, right, Control D to duplicate, then you can start thinking in terms of, well, I don't even really need to worry about the dimensions of the room necessarily don't have to be square, right? I can start to experiment with like different room sizes. I want to stretch something out. Let's be a little more dramatic. Now this will mean that the UVs need to be updated, possibly, right? And especially consider like a new texture, because this is going to cause stretching, right? It's maybe a little more clear. The bottom here, right? It'll cause some texture stretching if you start to stretch your object. But you could have things like, you know, boss rooms or puzzle rooms if you were going to use this method of just putting together your level, right? Or what's probably going to be even faster than this, right? It is if I use the paint faces method. Right? So let's say that I don't want to be distracted by all these walls, right? I could just select all the top of it, delete those, right? So that's my floor. But I could also hold down Tab and be like, well, this room is going to have, you know, like a different shape to it, right? And then maybe make sure that the entrance has the same sort of shape, but maybe it has, you know, like a little closet or a fake entrance here where you're going to put a chest. But you can also recreate the original walls. Maybe even start with a square and then decide, you know, what kinds of things you want to have inside this room. Maybe you already have like a top-down view of your level, and you could just start building that out, you know, with pieces in here. If you have an extra tall level, right, you don't necessarily also have to stick to the original height. I did use X to snap to grid when I made the walls, so that helps me keep like a certain height on the cuts, for my texture. So I'm gonna have to hold X while I'm in the move tool to snap to grid. But you could make much larger weapon or levels than the ones we looked at in class. All I would need to think about then is, what's the entrance to this level gonna look like, because it will go along this whole entrance at the top here, right? So for my level, what I was thinking about next was to make some sort of tunnels or hallways, thinner hallways. Kind of gonna hold X to snap to grid and make sure that things line up inside of Maya as well. But I kind of wanted some hallways that were maybe be about the size of my doors. Right, so then think about doing that, but really I want to get all of these here. Right, and then maybe this is the shape of a hallway. I've got some extra faces over here, obviously. I don't necessarily need to keep these. I could just carefully select them and delete. Right, if I want to keep the clutter out, but shouldn't really matter. Right, so I've got a hallway. It's a good time to save. If I was to apply the texture though, I'm not necessarily going to get a good result, right? I could fudge it a little bit and have the texture kind of shopped onto here, right? So here's the floor texture. Here's my new hallway. I haven't even unwrapped it yet, so the problem right off the bat, right, is that there are certain faces along here that are completely flat on the UVs, right? They've become just an edge, even though in actuality they have some extra points here that are on top of each other, right? So you can see there's a whole line of these extra points that from the walls that I made that are now just stretchy mess over here. So ideally I would just do another UV automatic on here. I could use UV shell to find the floor piece. Maybe just to, again, this is just to like Photoshop it if you're really in a hurry. But, ideally you would go through and texture this again. We're not going to get as lucky on the walls. We can use one new trick that I've noticed, which is the, not in align and snap, it is in arrange and layout. You can stack similar. I guess I have to select them first, stack similar. And that's going to try to find, sections that are the same shape and put them on top of each other. Now, unfortunately, it still doesn't know how to mirror things the way that we looked at previously. So you can flip UV here, right, and put things on top of each other. Let's see if the UV toolkit now will use stack similar. It doesn't look like they found each other there. Yeah. It tries, but yeah, ideally after unwrapping it, you would go into substance again and texture this as a new object with a new texture set. That's just the way it's going to go. But you could, right, at least get the floor on there, and then if you really wanted to spend more time in the UV, you could fix these walls up. Oh, actually I have wall problems here. So yeah, there's almost more work, you know, if you try to go just through the UVs and keep the same texture. So let's just pretend that we don't see the ugly bits of this. Anyway, other pieces, right, that I plan to make. Oops, not this. Maybe a larger room. So I could duplicate again, right, and maybe have a double wide room or an L-shaped corner, right? I still haven't really done my corners. So let's do a corner first. So click and then double click the next face in the line while holding shift to select in a line like that, holding X to match the height. And then, so in this case, right, I can use these H-shaped pieces to just keep a single width for the larger pieces, or I could decide, you know, that on my corners, right, that I want them to be a bit tighter corners. So I could raise parts of this part, right? I don't need any of that top part. Ciao. So if I have one corner, duplicate that, I'll move it over. I could use some of the symmetry options, right? But instead what I'm going to do is just scale it into the negative and make it a -1 scale. And in my case it was the X values, then I'm just going to round it off to -1. And that object is good, except that we haven't moved the pivot points on these new objects, right? Like I said, my plan, or the rule that I made on my first one, was going to be to put the pivot point at the entrance to each room. So I'll force myself to follow that rule again, holding D and then X. I can snap to the end there. That's already snapped to the grid, right? This piece isn't just like floating free form. So I can use snap to grid there. If your piece is just kind of off grid already, you could turn on the snap to point magnet up in the top under mesh tools. So that's the move tool. I actually want to hold D so that then I can snap the pivot point, right? And I can choose the spot. Now I'm a bit stuck, right? Because I didn't make this all the way, right? Or oh, I just snapped that one over. My bad. Okay. Maybe I leaned one over. Okay, all 7. So now I got a minor issue here. Let's just say that it's not an issue, and eyeball it. Let me think. Alrighty, we'll just move on to the next one. T, X. Nope. Now, again, it's a good idea to name things in Maya. So this is going to be left turn snap. This is a hallway. Undecided. This one is actually looks like a left turn if I'm going into it, but it'll be our right turn. And maybe this one will just be a medium hallway. Alright, so again, each of these need an automatic UV unwrap. In object mode, automatic. Object mode, automatic. I don't want to risk being in face mode, right, and not having like the whole object selected, because then it will only unwrap those faces, and wherever the other faces were in the UV, it'll just get lost. Alrighty, so they're all unwrapped. That's 4 new pieces. The fact that I've named them means that I could just export them all at once, because I had previously set the Unity project. It should be able to just tag all of these. So level geometry, it's set to the right folder. How did I want to? So the problem is, right, is that if I have them all selected, it's going to export as one FBX. I can still separate them inside of Unity. They should come in with the hierarchy, so let's test that. Okay, level geometry. Here it is, rooms, turns, and hallways. So if I pull this into the scene, right, it does come in all one piece, but it's just a hierarchy when it's all together. I can just separate all of these out by dragging them out of that hierarchy. It wants me to unpack it first, right? Unpack it completely. Drag them out. And I don't even need this dummy piece that it exported. Right? They all have their pivot points. So now I can snap into the grid inside of Unity if I want to, right? And that way, with the grid matching my previous piece, they should just line up. Now, if I haven't moved the previous piece, then I need to use the vertex snap mode, which is Shift V. I usually pick a corner on the far end of the object, and then you want to drag it onto the corner of the other object that you're trying to snap it to. And hit V to get out of that mode, because it is pretty annoying sometimes. So here, Shift V, get a good angle. Oh, Shift V is toggle, that's right. V, holding V makes it stay on that tool. something. I believe that the animations go a bit weird, so let's double check this as well. Oh, I plugged my controller in so that I could test out the gamepad support, and it works perfectly with the third-person controller. The only thing is that since I was using the old input system, the keyboard keys are the same. Oh, I forgot one crucial step, right? I forgot to add a collider to these objects. So, mesh collider. And I could just do them all at once, actually. Mesh colliders. Good to go. Now, let's say that I wanted to do something like I did back when I, was just playing around and did the skull door. If I want to, if I want to then model a door based on this size, right? I already have this room available in a scene, so I could just go ahead, duplicate this object, select some faces down here where the door would be, right? Maybe I want to have a little more room, so I can make it 2 or 3 pieces wide. Oh, whoops, grab some extra. Okay, that's going to be the height of the door. Okay. Now, if that's the only part of this model that I need, right? Let's say I can move this over. Then I could just delete these other faces, right? So I need to select inverse. Oops. Interesting. I think it's those other ones around the edge that no? Interesting. I don't know why it's not letting me just delete things. Maybe there's a vertex attached down here somewhere that I'm not aware of. Alright. So now this object will be big enough for a door. I don't necessarily even need to keep this object, right? Aside from it being a like size guide, I'd also want to fix the pivot, right? So I could turn on, maybe snap to vertex again, hold D, and then snap it back onto that object. From here, right, I might decide to make the door. I could even make things right here in the scene, I guess. could poke outside of the object as well. Doesn't need anything else. Just testing. It's really obvious. Alrighty, so I'm happy with this object. Maybe just move these guys out of the way. I guess this part should be further back. These pillars could use a little more love. But, so those are all good to go. Combine them. Mesh combine. UV automatic. So that I can texture them later. And then we can set to Unity selection. Door spikes. Back in Unity. Got a new object. Doorway is here and working. So if I just drag it on top of the doorway. Where does it go? Way over there. So let's see where I need to drag it. Maybe just into the scene first. So it also offset the pivot point of the parent object here. It looks like to somewhere on the grid, but it looks like a mystery spot, or is it on the player? Bit of a mystery spot. Oh, you know what it is? I have been forgetting to delete my history. And point is fine. Door plus spikes. In this case, I'm gonna go to my old object, and I can either, in this case, I also need to unpack it. I don't really need this top part. I don't really need the collider on the left and right. If I just make the main collider bigger, right? Since there was no code on those other pieces, I should be fine just deleting them. And then on the door itself, turning off the mesh renderer keeps its collider and its animation on there. Now the only thing to do is to tie this new object, spike door spikes. Does it let me separate them? No. So I guess I wasn't supposed to copy the pillars on to the same object. Let me separate those. Separate. Okay, now the door is separate. Oops. Sense unity selection. Door spikes. These two can recombine. I guess I should probably unwrap this guy again. UV automatic, right? Alright, so I've separated out the spikes. What's that right below it? I should just be able to tie this to the old door if I can find it. Doorway, door. Doorway spikes. Gotta play with the controller. Oh. Alright, through the spikes. Get through the blockade. And then mystery room. Up to you. So next step, right, would be if I wanted to take a break from Unity since I got some stuff done. Good time to save a new scene. Right, maybe instead of doing some design work, I'll swap over to Substance Painter and texture the rooms maybe, and definitely texture the spikes and the pillars, right, if I'm happy with those. Yeah, the pillars should be fine, even though they're a bit low poly. Substance will help with that. What you could do though, right, is instead make something more interesting for the pillars. So let's review the EP curve tool real quick. So here's my pillar object as it is, right, but I want to make something more interesting. Remember we made the street light last year with the EP curve tool and the what do they call it in here? In Max, I think it's called lathe. In here it's called something different, like rotate. It's not circularize. Oh, it's under surfaces, revolve. Okay, so surfaces revolve is what we're going to do with our EP curve. First, we choose the third tool over. I've switched into the curves and surfaces tab. And then I can think about the shape that a pillar might look like from the bottom. Right, it usually has some points of change, and then maybe even an outward curve to it. And then points at the top. Still be able to manipulate these points in vertex mode, is it? To exit the tool, I can just hit the arrow key. So, let me just move this out of the way. It should be that the pivot point is set to the center of the world, so I'm holding D to move that over. It's a pretty ugly curve right now. Can't control vertex, no curve point. That's what I need. Oops. Oh, edit point, sorry. So here I can see the kind of curves that I'm going to get. Fix some of these tighter areas and the areas where maybe there's too much curvature. It's usually good to go a bit overboard, what you think is too much first, and then dial it back after, rather than always just being afraid of going too far. Okay, object mode. So now this is gonna lathe around, so again, not substance, surfaces, revolve. I'll break out the options menu so that we can make some changes, because by default it might output to NURBS, which helps nobody. We work in polygons, right? You're also going to choose here, right, how many edges it's going to have. So in this old version, right, I think this one only had 8. That's why it looks like a stop sign. You guys don't have so many of those here. They're everywhere in the States. So next I need to think about how far away this is from the center line. because I believe it's going to revolve around, okay, so it is revolving around the object pivot, which means I might need to hold D and just change this pivot point to make this a wider pillar. Okay, so the segments is really the big one. Hit apply. And let's go see our handiwork. Right, that was the pillar from the EP curve tool. So pretty good. Alright, if I wanted to make sure that it was symmetrical, I could also just cut it in half. Right, pick a side, either side, actually kind of like the top better as a bottom. Maybe it needs to just flip over. Holding control. Yeah, like that, the original top, so cut it in half. Yeah, that was half. Oh my gosh, Tamagotchi's mad. And then I can use the mirror tool here. The only thing is that it always gets the axis wrong. Let's see here. Okay, come on, mirror tool. The other option again, maybe is to just reverse it like this with a negative scale of -1. Now, if I combine these two, I still have a seam in the middle, so I need to weld this. I need the merge tool, and with a very low value, since those verts are already on top of each other, I should be able to merge. You can check here how many verts are selected. Hit apply. Make sure that you always have the poly and vert stuff showing at, where do we show that stuff? Display, heads up display, poly count. Alright, I always want to have that information because it's useful in these kinds of cases. Alright, so I've got my pillar. Let's delete the history. This one, I can use an automatic, but using the cylindrical is also satisfying. I feel like cylindrical UVs are the king of UVs. So with the cylindrical unwrap, I don't know why it's larger than my U1 and V1. It's a bit annoying. It still feels a bit rough, so maybe I should optimize. And I've tried to use the align a little bit more, but it's a bit of a weird one. It's more for actually, align is actually for when you're selecting edges, but optimize, sometimes even unfold, it's a little more extreme. Work well. Alright. That pillar is good to go. I should also change the pivot to hold D, hold X. Make sure the pivot is in the ground. Now, as for the top of it, that's gonna be a stylistic thing. It looks like my previous rule, you know, looking at other stuff, is that it is capped on the top and on the back of the level. So I should really continue that. It's gonna also put a bit of a bump because now I have to redo this UV section. One of the earliest tools, mesh fill hole. Remember, this is not a good mesh for animation, or necessarily for texturing sometimes, because it's an n-gon, right? There are this many sides to it, whereas you see in most cases we only want 4 sides to a polygon. That is going to come into play when we do high poly objects in Mudbox, right? Or ZBrush, or sometimes people use Blender or Maya even for sculpting. The issue being that if you do not have all quads along your object, all 4-sided polygons, right? Like here, I actually have 5-sided polygons because of this little vert. So this is a 5-sided all along here. That kind of breaks the decimation system where you're smoothing objects. Sometimes Maya will do okay with it, but in Mudbox it's going to point out every single vertice that is not attached to the right number of faces. So when you're doing high poly stuff, it becomes a bigger deal. Alright, so I need to check the UV editor here, see what I can do about this top face that I just made. Let's just see if we can smush it into a corner. Get as much space as we can, but see if we can match it. Alright, let me delete the history in case I forgot. Is anything in here? So now again, if I have some placed, I could potentially just drag it on top of there. Sometimes that works. In this case, it's gone and done a weird offset again, so just drag it in manually and place these guys. The pivot is set to center on the global, so that's why they did not hit the floor. So what I want is floor time. Okay, make sure it looks good to the player. Right now these do not have a collider on them, right? So mesh collider. I might even not even need a mesh collider. I could just use something like a capsule collider. Let's see if I've got the shape. You know, if you're building a big level, at least you don't want to necessarily have everything be a mesh collider, because collision is something that is very CPU dependent, right? So it's going to take up more cycles and can slow your game down. So if this is the one that I'm happy with, right, let's just make a few prefabs. That way I know that these things are working, and I've kind of backed them up somewhere. So this is the door that I've made with spikes. Double spikes. pillars are good to go. They just need a material on them, right? So they'll have to get chucked into substance. And then I can start, deciding how to reskin some of my other traps or my other buttons and things that I've made, right? Where I'm going to put things. If I said this is my first like puzzle room, right? Maybe the puzzle is just like, are you going to be able to hit the big glowing red dot, which should be able to. Maybe my skull door isn't epic enough. I need to up the stakes a bit. This controller. Let's just swap. Button is no longer facing the viewable angle. Is this the problem of the animated objects returning? Play root motion. Yeah, the button, it wants to go back where it came from, so let's create an empty parent maybe. Huh. Let's get the offset. Okay, so let's apply root motion. Hopefully that's gonna mean the button works. Now, this is an example of maybe not doing the right thing, right? In that I'm making myself run the puzzle before I can test it. Usually if I'm gonna, be testing a puzzle that I'm not quite sure works, I will move it all the way close to the spawn, right, into my toy room. But it's feeling okay. Have to do definitely gotta do some more barrel placement. My NPC talks. One thing I should do is put some light around my NPC, right, to draw some attention to her, and maybe put her in front of a lighter area so that there's some contrast when I look at her. You don't want them to be the same color as the wall. Say this pillar has got a torch on it that's lit, and maybe make the other pillar just unlit, so there's a bit of contrast in there. Right, so right away my eye's drawn to the light. which means I come over and I check the NPC out. That was a lucky coincidence. When I hit F to talk to the NPC, it also triggered the gate. So maybe my gate trigger can be a bit smaller. Or potentially I could even bind the gate event to react to the NPC finishing her sentence. This is why it's good to, play test your game, but also have other people play test it. Because they will find dreadful mistakes that you've overlooked. Just because we always play our own games, the same way. So yeah, that gets me a little bit further. Next steps, right, would be go in and texture these guys. Go and texture the new art pieces maybe that I've made for the doors. And then if I'm happy with something, right, make a prefab out of it, put it everywhere. And again, look for what's fun about it, right? Like if this stuff is not yet fun to you, right? Maybe we need to up the challenge, right? Like give yourself some deadly pits to fall into, right? Maybe some jumping puzzles if that's what your game involves, right? You could start putting some other obstacles in here. But typically these first few rooms are just, maybe the first 2 rooms even, are just to get a feel for what's the movement of the game. Think about every tutorial that you've ever done, right? So how does the player move around the environment? And then the second room, usually, how do I interact with the environment? You don't want to toss them into a burning pit before they've even figured out what their purpose is, right? So if I was going to do another one, another hallway that was dangerous, right? Maybe to teach them that there's danger in the world. Then I would probably do it as a 3rd or 4th room, right? Rather than just punishing the player for not knowing what's what. Oh, right, because my hallway is an odd number. Count your cubes, because it's annoying when you're off. Alright, so 3rd room, again, might just be a bit of an entryway and then like a test of skill or fail error, or to introduce the player to a new type of obstacle, right? So since it had been a while since I saved, I believe I did the pillar in the meantime, right? That means that in order to get this pillar, if I want to work on it some more, right, the only place I have it backed up is here as an FBX in my scene. Well, actually, it's not in the prefabs folder. It's wherever I exported it. So, good time to end. Hope that helps, guys. Good luck.